Good morning. The other day we talked about hammers, and I thought we would continue our discussion on hammers with making a hammer. However, before you can make a hammer, you probably need a few tools. Hammers have to have an eye put in them, and that requires punching in most cases. And we'll talk about some of the alternatives and ways to make that easier. Then it requires drifting. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about punches and drifts for hammer eyes. And since this is the first discussion on making tools for the shop that we've done, we'll talk a little bit about steel sources and what makes good punches and drifts and how to figure out how to harden and temper those. So that's what we'll do today, and then in another video we'll use those tools to actually make a hammer. Every hammer has to have a handle. The handle is fit through an eye in the hammer head. Depending on the weight of the hammer, the eye will be larger or smaller. For our first hammer, we're going to make a relatively small hammer of about 2 pounds. That has a relatively small eye. This is obviously a commercial ball peen hammer. It's one I'm going to reforge into another tool. But because it doesn't have a handle in it right now, we can discuss the tools for making an eye. So the first thing that has to happen is you have to punch the eye. And there are lots of different varieties of punches. There are flat bottom punches. There are punches that come to a small V-point, which are really quite popular these days, although it's not one I've explored too much. And you can slit it with a chisel and then drift it. The most common, though, is the oval punch that is close. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that is not quite the refined eye. The punch does not create the finished eye. You have to have a second tool called a drift. The drift is a tapered pin, in most cases, that will provide the final shape of the eye. And you notice this drift did not make this hammer, but it's almost a perfect fit because they're fairly standard. And that's because handles are fairly standard. And that goes in both ways, and that creates a little bit of an hourglass that helps hold the handle when you put a wedge in the handle. Punches can also be handled, but we're not going to get into making handled tools right now. We're going to make handheld tools. So where do you start? Well, if you're going to make your own handle, start just by having a good idea of what you want for the eye of your hammer. But if you're going to buy a handle, which is where I suggest you start, is just go to the hardware store, and they should have handles in various sizes and various types. This is a 14-inch handle, and this is a machinist's hammer handle. It's just what I happen to have in the size for this handle, or this hammer. Blacksmith's hammer handles are slightly heavier through here than the machinist hammer handles, but for a small hammer, the machinist handles are fine, and most hardware stores are going to have a handle they call a blacksmith's hammer handle, even though hardly anybody buying them are blacksmiths, but that's just what goes into your common variety of handheld 2 to 4 pound hammers that people may have in the shop. So they're fairly easy to find. If not, you can get them online. I buy a lot from a place called House Handle Company, and they have a website. But if you start with your handle, you'll know about what your eye shape needs to be, and that will define your drift. And you can just kind of compare the drift. And this drift is actually a cast ductile iron, not regular cast iron. This one's actually can be hammered on. Regular cast iron you can't. And these are available on the internet too if you don't want to make a drift. I think Pay Tool and probably Centaur Forge sell these, and I think the people that make them probably sell them on eBay. That's where I got this, but I've had this for 20 years, so I'm not completely sure. But I have seen them recently, so I know they're out there. So we have an idea of what our eye shape is because we have a handle that has that eye shape. And then we want a punch that will give us an eye close enough to make that shape. So the first thing we need to do then is make the punch and the drift. And we're going to have to choose some steel. Now, I am really an advocate of new steel and think that if you can find a steel that you like and stick with that steel, learn its properties, figure out what it likes for hardening and tempering, you're going to be better off in the long run than using a different steel every time just because you happen to scrounge it. But blacksmiths do like to scrounge. I like a good scrapyard as much as the next guy, and I've made plenty of tools out of this stuff here. This is just plain old coil spring. This is a fairly heavy coil spring. It's about 3/4 of an inch, just a hair under. But we don't really know what it is. At one point, coil springs and leaf springs were mostly 5160 steel, which is a good medium carbon steel. But anymore, every auto manufacturer has their own proprietary steel formulas, and it may or may not be something similar to 5160. You're going to have to do some tests on it to find out how it hardens and how it tempers so you don't break your tool. If you harden in the wrong quench medium, if you think, oh, well, I want a good hard tool, so I'm going to take this spring steel and I'm going to quench it in water, and it's an oil hardening steel, it's probably going to crack. If it's an air hardening steel, I guarantee it's going to crack. So you have to figure out, is it an air hardening steel, an oil hardening steel, a water hardening steel, or maybe it should be hardened in brine. And that's why it's good to buy steel that you know. You can just look it up in a book or a chart, and it's available on the internet. I've got an app for my phone that'll tell me what kind of steel to, how to harden and temper different kinds of steel. Another good source for punches, and this is a bit more reliable than springs, this is sucker rod. You can see this fitting here where you can screw one rod to the other. They probably are in 12-foot lengths originally, although I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever had a full length of one. This is what drives the pump in an oil well, and they replace these on a regular basis long before they fail. So coil springs and leaf springs frequently are replaced because they failed, which means it's stressed, which means it's more likely to crack when you make a tool from it. But this is pretty reliable stuff, and this one's a little heavier. It comes in different sizes. This is about 7/8 of an inch. And there's enough steel in this 3-foot piece here to make, 4 tools probably. And this is probably what we're going to make the punch out of, because the punch doesn't need to be as big as the drift. But I don't think it's big enough to get the drift out of. At least not this drift. Another good source for salvage steels are jackhammer bits. This is the only one I've ever seen that's shaped like this. Most of them are a little bit fatter, which is bigger than you really need for the hammer-eye drift. I think this is going to be just about ideal. It compares very nicely size-wise to our commercial drift. But again, I have no idea what steel this is. It's probably an S-series steel, a shock-resisting tool steel. But is it S1, S7, who knows what? So I don't know if it is air hardening. I don't know if it's oil hardening or water hardening. A lot of the jackhammer bits seem to harden pretty well in oil, and some of them not quite, and probably need to be water hardened. So we're going to have to do some tests on this. However, having just said that, a drift doesn't necessarily have to be hardened. If you make it out of good tough steel, it's going to still be tougher than a mild steel drift. And if you're only using it once or twice, a mild steel drift will work. But after you've made about 3 hammers with it, you're going to wish you'd made it out of tool steel, because the tool steel drift is going to make you a dozen or 2 dozen hammers before you have to clean it up on the grinder, and then it's back to work with it. Whereas the mild steel drift, after 2 or 3 hammers, you just throw it away and make another one. So there's a quick little bit on tool steels or salvaged steels. They may or may not be tool steels. Springs are not tools, so spring steel may not be tool steel. For making these tools with new steel, 4140 is a good choice. That's an oil hardening steel. 5160 is a good choice, also oil hardening. S7 is a really good steel. It's a little harder to work, a little more finicky. It's an air hardening steel, and if you're not real into hardening and having good control of your temperature based on color in the forge, or have an electronic oven like I do, S7 may be a bit exotic to work with. H13 is even more so. It's a good hot resisting steel, but I don't think it makes a good punch. It's not that hard. So I would stick with simpler steels to start with. 4140 is a good starting steel. It's available from most industrial suppliers in rounds, squares, flats, and for that matter, when we make our hammer, that's what we're going to use for the hammer. I've got this chunk of 4140, and we're going to make a hammer out of that. But first we're going to make the tools. Well, I've cut our pieces of steel. This is the piece of the jackhammer bit, and this is our piece of sucker rod. Both of them are about 9 inches long. I like it. The handheld tool, I like about 10-inch tools. It gives you a good grip. It helps stabilize or visualize better whether you're straight up and down. The shorter a tool is, the harder it is to see vertical, and it helps keep your hand away from the heat just a little bit more. I want to start just by slightly tapering this struck end. This isn't the punch end, this is the struck end, and I'm going to leave it a little bit of an octagon. Remember, for square, then octagon, and if you're going to round it, then you round it after it's octagon, but I'm going to leave it slightly octagonal. Perhaps a square with the corners knocked off might be a better description. And there's two reasons to do this. One is largely aesthetic. I think it just makes a tool that I'm prouder of and like using a little bit more. But it also helps concentrate your hammer blows at the center of the tool as opposed to off to one side on the larger round. The next thing I'm going to want to do to our punch is create a bit of a flat. That helps you index, and it'll be parallel with the punch surface. And that way, when it's in your hand, you know where the center line is running. This is a technique, both the little bit of an octagon and this treatment is something that I first saw Mark Asprey demonstrate at a blacksmithing conference, and I really like this style, so I'm using it, but it is not my invention. If you don't know who Mark is, I suggest you look him up on YouTube. He is an outstanding demonstrator and instructor and one of the best blacksmiths out there right now. But don't quit watching my channel just because you go watch Mark's. I'd appreciate you sticking around. So we're going to offset this on the edge of the anvil. We don't need any special tools. Just line your hammer blows up, and you might have to get right over the anvil so you can see. In doing this, I just let the piece swell a little bit. I'm not worried about keeping the sides of the tool corralled. I want it to be a little wider there. And you want to keep this straight. You can kind of see what I'm creating there. So that's about all I need to do there. At this point, it's really just trying to straighten it up. This will be dressed on a grinder through here. or with a file or a hot rasp, either way. So now we can, there's one other thing I want to do before I turn that around. You can see this one has been marked, or hopefully you can see that, right there, with what kind of steel it is. So that's important for two reasons. If you're using different steels and you ever have to reharden and retemper, you know how to harden and temper this. It also gives you an idea of what tool is performing the best. This one says S1. Now the sucker rod is most likely 4130. Most of the sucker rod I have is that, and that's what I'm going to stamp this. And I kind of know that through experience. Do a little research and testing yourself before you make a decision, or you can just write sucker rod on there. But that's a lot of hand stamping. So the next thing we'll do is we will go ahead and stamp this as a 4130 steel. So here I've marked that 4130. Hindsight being 2020, it occurs to me we could just mark it SR for sucker rod and not stamp out sucker rod, but I didn't think of that at the time. But that gives me a pretty good idea what I'm working with if I want to evaluate the use of this tool later. So our next step will be to actually work on the punching end. You can see it's tapered this way, and this one is parallel just because of its size. We may let the one we're working on flare out just a little bit so it doesn't drag in the hole so much as you punch it, and make it a little bit easier to use. You just have to be careful not to trap it in there by forging the piece with the punch in. The punch is not a drift or a mandrel, it's for punching holes. So that's the next thing we'll do. Now remember, we put this flat in here as an index, so we want to make sure that our punch end is in the same plane. We'll put a gentle taper back about 2 inches. We'll clean that up on a grinder. We want the edges to be round. We want the sides to be relatively flat. We are at a little bit over an inch, about 1 1/8 inches, and we're about a 1/2 inch thick. So I think I'll dress that up a little bit in the next heat, and then that's really about all it takes to make a simple punch. I try to keep the surface of the tool on the anvil. So here I'm tipping the tool up, or my hand down I should say, to catch this angle. But over here my hand is tipped up to do this angle. And again, I want this side round, so I can round that up while I'm cleaning the surface. Make sure it's straight. You're not going to be able to straighten it later. And if it's crooked, it's going to affect the way you punch your hole. Okay, so that's just a hair under a half and just a hair over an inch. We'll do a little bit of cleanup on the belt grinder to make sure that is exactly what we want. Now, if you don't have power tools to sand and shape and grind with, an old farrier's rasp makes a pretty good hot rasp. Since this is the Mark Asprey style of punch, we might as well quote Mark. He says, "There has never been a grinder made that can keep up with a motivated blacksmith, a piece of hot iron, and a rasp." So So we'll see if we're motivated or not. But use an old rasp, not a new one. But we can use that to dress the punch with. Not locked in place as well as I would like, but power tools are certainly easier, but this does work. Then you can finish this up with a regular file cold. Because we're using a wore out file and hot metal, it's okay to drag it both directions. Odds are you got this for free anyways. I've been using the same Farrier's rasp for 10 years and I haven't ruined it yet. Now if that's the only way you've got to shape stuff like this, get it hot again and go back after it. If you're done hot rasping, bring it up to a critical temperature, which would be non-magnetic for most steels, and bury it in a bucket of vermiculite, wood ashes, lye works, or lime, I'm sorry, lime, not lye, but lime can be kind of caustic and sort of nasty in the shop. So the vermiculite or the wood ashes are my preferred. The gas forge, you can also just turn the gas off and let it cool at the forge and let this de-stress. And it looks like this video is going to come close to running a full hour, so I've decided to split it into 3 parts. So we're going to call it quits for the day, and we'll pick up tomorrow with the forging of the drift, and then the final video will cover hardening and tempering. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel. And by all means, go and watch some other videos and share everything with your friends, and we'll see you later.